Chuck liked to take evening walks in the park. The tranquility helped clear his mind after long days at the office. Tonight, the air was cool, the sky clear, and the park nearly empty. Chuck followed his usual path, a winding trail through dense trees and neatly kept gardens. He had just passed the small pond when he first noticed the man, a tall figure standing under a street lamp, just far enough away to be indistinct. Chuck didn't think much of it. The park was public, after all. He continued walking, but the hair on the back of his neck stood up. After another 10 minutes, Chuck glanced over his shoulder. The man was still there, maintaining the same distance. Chuck's pulse quickened. He thought about turning back, but his car was closer if he continued forward. The path curved around a thick grove of trees, and Chuck decided to test his theory. He picked up his pace slightly, then turned sharply into the trees. He hid behind a large oak and waited, his breath shallow. The man appeared, walking briskly, his head turning from side to side, searching. Chuck's heart pounded. He could see the man more clearly now. He was wearing a dark coat, his hands shoved into the pockets, his face shadowed by a baseball cap. The man paused, looking around, then continued down the path at a slower pace. Chuck waited until he was sure the man was out of sight, then slipped out from behind the tree and doubled back. He needed to get to his car. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made him jump. He forced himself to stay calm, to move quietly. When he reached the pond again, he saw the man ahead, standing still, looking in the opposite direction. Chuck's breath caught. How had he gotten there so quickly? He ducked behind a bush, considering his options. His car was in the parking lot just beyond the playground. If he sprinted, he could make it in less than 2 minutes. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage, then bolted. The man turned at the sound, his eyes locking onto Chuck. Chuck ran faster, adrenaline surging through him. He could hear footsteps behind him, closing in. He didn't dare look back. He reached the playground, his lungs burning, and raced across the sandpit. His car was in sight. He fumbled for his keys, nearly dropping them in his panic. He heard the man's heavy breathing behind him. Chuck yanked the car door open, threw himself inside, and slammed the door shut just as the man reached him. He jammed the key into the ignition, his hands shaking, and started the car. The man pounded on the window, his face twisted in anger. Chuck sped out of the parking lot, his heart racing. In the rearview mirror, he saw the man standing in the lot, watching him leave. Chuck drove straight home, constantly checking his mirrors. He parked in his driveway, sat in the car for a moment, trying to calm down. He couldn't shake the image of the man's face. Who was he? Why was he following him? Inside, Chuck locked all the doors and windows, drawing the curtains. He poured himself a drink, his hands still trembling. He needed to think. Maybe he should call the police, but what would he say? That a man had been following him in a public park. He decided to sleep on it. Maybe it was just a random encounter, a one-time thing. He'd be more careful next time. But as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The man's face haunted him, and sleep did not come easily. The next day, Chuck couldn't concentrate at work. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face. He tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the feeling of being watched persisted. His colleagues noticed his distraction, but he waved off their concerns. As evening approached, Chuck debated whether to take his usual walk. Part of him wanted to avoid the park entirely, but another part was determined not to let fear control him. He decided to go, but he'd stick to the well-lit areas and stay alert. He arrived at the park just as the sun was setting. The familiar path seemed more ominous in the fading light. He walked briskly, scanning his surroundings. The park was busier tonight, with couples strolling and joggers passing by. Chuck felt a bit more at ease. About halfway through his walk, he saw a figure up ahead, standing still. His heart skipped a beat. Was it the same man? As he got closer, he realized it was just a woman, adjusting her headphones. He let out a sigh of relief and continued on. When he reached the pond, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced around, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the unease lingered. He quickened his pace, eager to get back to his car. As he approached the playground, he saw him. The man from the night before, standing under the same street lamp. Chuck froze. The man's eyes locked onto his, a predatory smile spreading across his face. Chuck's instinct screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stay calm. He turned slowly and walked towards his car, trying to appear nonchalant. He could hear the man's footsteps behind him, matching his pace. His heart pounded in his chest. He was halfway to his car when he broke into a run. The footsteps behind him quickened. He reached his car, fumbling with the keys again. He managed to unlock the door and threw himself inside. The man was right behind him, but this time he didn't try to break the window. Instead, he stood there, a cold smile on his face, and mouthed something Chuck couldn't hear. Then he turned and walked away. Chuck watched him go, confusion and fear swirling in his mind. Why hadn't the man tried to attack him? What did he want? Chuck drove home, his mind racing. He decided he couldn't ignore this any longer. He had to find out who this man was and why he was following him. Once home, Chuck called the police. He reported the incidents, describing the man and his behavior. The officer took his statement and promised to send a patrol car to the park that night. Chuck felt a small measure of relief. But as he lay in bed, his mind wouldn't rest. He replayed the encounters over and over, trying to find some clue, some reason. The man's face loomed in his thoughts, his cold smile haunting Chuck. The next morning, Chuck woke to a loud knocking on his door. He glanced at the clock. It was barely dawn. He got up, his heart pounding again. Was it the man? He peered through the peephole and saw a police officer. Chuck opened the door, his anxiety mixing with hope. "We need to talk," the officer said. "There's been a development." Chuck's blood ran cold. What could have happened? He nodded and stepped aside, letting the officer in, bracing himself for what he was about to hear. John had always considered his grandmother's house a place of warmth and comfort. Nestled in the outskirts of the small town of Elmswood, the old Victorian-style home had an air of rustic charm. However, after his grandmother passed away, the house had felt different. It wasn't just the loneliness or the eerie silence that had settled over the property. It was something more sinister. John inherited the house and decided to move in temporarily while he sorted through his grandmother's belongings. The first few nights were uneventful, but on the fourth night, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the basement. At first, he dismissed it as the creaking of the old house, but the sound grew louder and more persistent. Determined to get to the bottom of it, John grabbed a flashlight and cautiously descended the creaky wooden stairs to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the musty smell of damp earth filled his nostrils. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and long-forgotten relics. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence. John swept the flashlight beam across the basement, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. He was about to head back upstairs when he noticed a small door in the corner that he had never seen before. It was partially hidden behind an old armoire. Curiosity piqued, he moved the heavy piece of furniture aside and approached the door. The door was old and weathered, with rusty hinges and a heavy padlock. John's heart raced as he realized he had never seen this part of the basement before. Determined to investigate, he searched the basement for something to break the lock. He found a crowbar among his grandfather's old tools, and with considerable effort, pried the lock open. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway that seemed to lead further underground. The air inside was even colder and carried a strange metallic scent. John hesitated, his mind racing with thoughts of what could be down there. Gathering his courage, he stepped into the passage and followed it to a set of stone stairs leading deeper into the darkness. As he descended, The tapping sound resumed, louder and more frantic. John's pulse quickened, and his flashlight flickered ominously. At the bottom of the stairs, he found another door, this one made of thick, reinforced wood. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see a dim, flickering light. John pushed the door open and gasped. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the basement. It was immaculately clean, with white-tiled walls and a single hanging light bulb casting eerie shadows. In the center of the room was a large metal table, and on it, various surgical tools were meticulously arranged. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, but it was what he saw next that made his blood run cold. Along the far wall were several large metal cages, and inside one of them was a frail, disheveled figure. The person was barely conscious, muttering incoherently. John recognized the face. It was Mr. Thompson, a local who had been reported missing several weeks ago. John rushed to the cage and tried to open it, but it was locked tight. "Hold on, Mr. Thompson, I'll get you out of here," he whispered urgently. He searched the room for keys but found none. Desperate, he picked up a heavy wrench from the table and began to bash the lock. The noise echoed through the basement, and John's mind raced with fear of who might come. Finally, the lock gave way, and John opened the cage. Mr. Thompson, weak and trembling, collapsed into John's arms. She's coming back," he whispered hoarsely. "We have to get out of here." John helped Mr. Thompson to his feet and supported him as they made their way back up the passageway. As they reached the basement, John heard the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open and footsteps echoing through the house. Panic surged through him. They had to hide. Thinking quickly, John led Mr. Thompson to a hidden alcove behind a stack of old boxes. They crouched there, holding their breath as the footsteps grew louder. The footsteps echoed ominously closer, each creak of the wooden floor above intensifying John's dread. He strained to hear, trying to discern who it was. Had someone else discovered the hidden room? Or was it someone more dangerous? A shadow fell across the basement stairs, and a figure began descending slowly. John's grip on the wrench tightened as he prepared to defend himself. Mr. Thompson, barely conscious, leaned heavily against John, his breathing shallow and labored. The figure stepped into the dim light of the basement, revealing a tall, gaunt man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. John didn't recognize him, but there was an air of menace about the stranger that made his skin crawl. The man surveyed the basement, his gaze lingering on the displaced armoire and the open door to the hidden room. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "I see you found my little secret," he said, his voice low and chilling. John's mind raced. This man had to be the one responsible for the horrors in the hidden room. "Stay back," John shouted, brandishing the wrench. "I've called the police." The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Do you think that scares me? You don't know who you're dealing with." Without warning, the man lunged at John. John swung the wrench with all his might, but the man dodged deftly, grabbing John's wrist and twisting it painfully. The wrench clattered to the floor. John struggled, but the man's grip was like iron. Just then, Mr. Thompson, mustering what little strength he had left, reached for a heavy wooden crate nearby and swung it at the man's head. The crate connected with a sickening thud, and the man staggered, releasing John. "Run," Mr. Thompson rasped, collapsing back to the floor. John didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Mr. Thompson and hauled him to his feet. Together, they stumbled up the basement stairs, the sound of the man's enraged shouts echoing behind them. They reached the ground floor and burst through the front door into the night. John's car was parked at the end of the driveway, and he fumbled for his keys as they ran. The man was already on their heels, a dark silhouette against the light from the open door. John finally got the car door open and shoved Mr. Thompson inside. He jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and slammed his foot on the gas. The car roared to life and sped down the driveway, just as the man reached the porch, his face twisted in fury. As they raced down the dark, empty road, John glanced in the rearview mirror. The house receded into the distance, the figure of the man growing smaller until it vanished entirely. John's hands trembled on the steering wheel, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Mr. Thompson was slumped in the passenger seat, his breathing shallow. "We need to get you to a hospital," John said, his voice shaking. They drove to the nearest town, where John pulled into the emergency room parking lot. He rushed inside, shouting for help. Nurses and doctors swarmed around Mr. Thompson, lifting him onto a gurney and wheeling him inside. John sank into a chair in the waiting room, his mind reeling. The revelation about his grandmother's house, the hidden room, and the terrifying man still felt unreal. He had so many questions and no answers. Hours later, a police officer approached John. "Mr. Thompson is going to be okay, thanks to you," the officer said. "But we need to know everything you can tell us about what happened." John recounted the events in detail, from the first strange noises to the horrifying discovery in the basement. The officer listened intently, taking notes. "From what Mr. Thompson told us, it seems your grandmother was involved in something very dark," the officer said carefully. "We'll need to conduct a thorough investigation of the house. It's likely there are more victims." John nodded numbly, the weight of the situation settling over him. His grandmother, the woman who had baked him cookies and told him stories, was somehow connected to this nightmare. He couldn't reconcile the loving memories with the horrific reality. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, news reports, and restless nights. The house was cordoned off as a crime scene, and investigators combed through every inch, uncovering more evidence of the grisly activities that had taken place. John struggled with his emotions, feeling both grief for the grandmother he thought he knew and horror at the monstrous secrets she had hidden. But amidst the chaos, one thing became clear: he couldn't let the darkness of the past consume him. He decided to sell the house, determined to start fresh and leave the nightmare behind. As he stood outside the house one last time, watching the sun set over Elmswood, he felt a sense of closure. The secrets of the basement would no longer haunt him, and the victims, like Mr. Thompson, could begin to heal.